This is a simple overview really of what I do in terms of astro imaging. It's not necessarily to say it's the best way of doing it. It certainly doesn't mean there aren't alternative ways of doing it, and there certainly are people out there who could advise in better ways of doing it, but it is nonetheless the way I do it. So anyway, let's move on. This is the first and most recommended thing you can do if you're interested in astrophotography, which is retire. In the course of 50 years of plus of work, I actually migrated from the south to the north, which is coincidentally moving from my father's hometown to my mother's hometown, and we've been in the northeast for in excess of 30 years now and regard it quite clearly as home. Anyway, having retired, quick look back at whence I came. Back in the 60s, when I first started showing an interest in astronomy, there were key influences. Patrick Moore, Neil Armstrong, not to mention two of the more important. I was fortunate enough to get to know Patrick in later years, and he was every bit as enthusiastic and as welcoming as people regard him. So, as a young man, like many, my first venture was to Dixon's and to buy a Prinz 60mm refractor on a slightly wobbly equatorial mount. But nonetheless, and as you can see, I took it as a rather serious thing, feeling that you had to be very formal if you were going to do any astronomical observing, but why, I do not know looking back on it, but there we are. That was my first telescope. And then the best thing I did, having got that, was joined the local society, at that time the Portsmouth Astronomical Group, which gave me an opportunity to participate in the building of their observatory and gained me the use of a 12.5-inch f10 Newtonian reflector. The one thing it did do, because of course computers didn't exist at the time in terms of astronomical control, it gave me a chance to learn the sky and learn how to use setting circles, which was all that was really available to the amateur at the time. And when I look back on it, very few of us actually had personal telescopes. Generally the prices were prohibitive to the average person. Sadly, that observatory now looks like this. It's a residential estate with lovely light polluted sky. But anyway, moving on from that, past retirement, 2015, why buy one telescope when you can get two? The worst thing, and if I talk about mistakes, the biggest mistake I ever made was getting rid of the EQ6 with the 6-inch refractor. Probably should have sold the refractor, but I should have kept the mount, and when I bought my 9.25, I should have put it on that mount rather than buying an alt-as. But, you know, wise after the event. What I don't regret getting was the little 127 Maksutov, which was an absolutely super little grab and go, punched well over its weight, and still, I think, great little starter scopes for those who fancy something a little more automated and easy to transport, which is a key issue. And of course, as when I was down south, gaining collective wisdom, as I would put it, by joining the Sunderland Society was probably one of the best things I did. it gave me once again access to other instruments, but it also gave me access to a lot of good experience, a lot of good advice, and a lot of good friendships. So this is where it all started to go slightly for a ball of chalk, in so much as I was drawn to by this Celestron 9 1/4 on an evolution mount. Now, don't get me wrong, the evolution mount is a great mount if you're interested in visual observation or perhaps planetary and lunar photography. Has its own integral battery, fully automated, very nice instrument to use, but absolutely useless if you ever want to do any deep sky photography. But anyway, it gave me some good times, and certainly the OTA has proved to be an absolute wonderful benefit in terms of aperture and the general performance of the scope. And although some people question the merits of F10, I've been greatly encouraged when these photographs were achieved recently with someone using a telescope that's F20, albeit that it's a million miles away and doesn't suffer from the disadvantage of looking through the atmosphere. But it is interesting that this is a very long focal length telescope, but it's not interested in wide field of view. It's dealing with very constrained fields of view. The best thing I did personally was to persuade a friend to help me convert my existing shed into one with a runoff roof, which has proved hugely successful, and you can't underrate the merits of having your telescope set up and ready to go. These little icons here indicate that I've got power, I've got Wi-Fi, and I've got a robust pier, even more robust than is photographed here actually. So actually getting access to the scope and getting it up and running is a very, very quick process and gives you a chance to take advantage even of the most fleeting moments of clear sky. So moving into imaging, my first venture was to just take my humble Nikon D3200 with an intervalometer and the appropriate adapter. And naturally enough, I started on what one might perceive as the easiest object, which was the moon. And with all due modesty, I eventually got some reasonable results, reasonable enough that several of them have been published, and I was actually paid for a few, which is amazing. But it was never going to be anywhere near the quality that I was looking to achieve, particularly in respect of deep sky imaging. And I've still got a ways to go on that particular journey. But what I decided to do was to correct the shortfall in terms of my equipment selection. So, and I would recommend for anybody buying a 9 1/4, get yourself a focal reducer as well, because it dramatically extends the range of the instrument in terms of its usability. I mean, the Celestron one that I use brings it down to f6.3. It makes it significantly brighter, the field somewhat wider. And then in combination with that, and I'll be quite honest, I bought this telescope because it was the one that Chris Duffy had bought. Saved me doing any serious research, and I can't say that I regret it in any way, form or manner. It has continued to be a very good telescope, very, very, very versatile, very versatile camera that Works both for deep sky and also for lunar and planetary and solar, of course. The other thing I did, an absolute bargain basement price, I managed to pick up a second-hand HEQ5 Pro. I then immediately, with the help of Dave Beedham, did the belt modification, which is the best possible thing you can do to an HEQ5. It makes it so quiet, eliminates a huge amount of backlash, and just really, I can't say anything bad about it, really. It's proved an excellent investment. But it does, of course, mean once you've got all this kit lined up that you've got to go out there and master the software applications. And that's as much as anything about persistence and the capacity to learn menus. The solution I use required a greater understanding of 4 basic programs. EQ mod, because that's how I now connect my scope to the laptop. APT, which I use for deep sky imaging. Stellarium, which I now use as part and parcel of my alignment process and for absolute ease in finding items in the sky. And then once I've gone through the process of alignment and getting the image into the field of view, PhD, obviously, for ongoing guiding. As the little cartoon indicates, this is a path you take that's absolutely full of pitfalls, and you do learn as much by your mistakes as you do by the things you do right. In fact, probably more so. But it's also part of the joy of the astronomy interest. It's a challenge, and it always will be. And there's always something to learn, either for yourself or from others. So mechanically bringing everything together, as I've said, I've got a more robust pier, courtesy of our good friend Harry. I bought what is a ridiculously cheap guide scope with a helical focuser, but it's proved to be outstanding, really good 60mm aperture, 240mm focal length, but it does a very, very good job. I fitted a Crayford, very early days actually, fitted a Crayford onto the SCT to address some of the potential issues of mirror flop, and then subsequently have fitted a Zoo EAF to allow for auto-focusing. And this, of course, gives you lots and lots and lots of wires. So I then, again learning from others, have put together this little box of tricks, which basically amounts to a power distribution box, a USB 3 hub for cameras, EQ mod cable, and the control of the focuser, and also a high-tech Astro power control for the dew heaters, which is, the whole system works very well, and the dew heaters perform particularly effectively. I very, very rarely put a shield on, except for in the most extreme of conditions. But that's how it all comes together mechanically, and generally speaking it works well, and I never really experience any cable snags. And the only thing that is inclined to snag occasionally is the actual remote control for the focuser, which has a very long cable, but I've learned to avoid that. So let's look at the actual real world experience. First of all, how do I connect Stellarium? Well, what I do with Stellarium, given that I park the scope correctly in the first place, I will slew to a bright star. Here shows you the connection running down here on the right into the laptop, which links the cameras and the EQ mod cable. given I park correctly, I can unpark, I can then slew to an object, and then what I do, and some may find this slightly strange, I then, and eventually it will move, having selected Deneb, I then get it on screen, and in fact typically we'll use Sharp Cap. And the reason I use Sharp Cap is because it allows me to access both cameras. I use the indices and the controls on the EQ mod to bring the object dead center, and then having got it to center, I will select it and sync the mount. What that basically does is effectively gives me a 1-star alignment, which is all I need, and that 1-star alignment sets the mount up and pretty much accurately allows me to move through stellarium to any object that I particularly select. And I'll tend to do that before then going into APT and plate solving. I just find it makes the whole process rather swifter and more secure. The next stage, obviously, having got the object in and gone in and done the plate solving, which we'll come to in due course, is to get the guiding going. Generally, I find with multi-star guiding, and I'm using my Zoo 178mm camera for guiding these days, which has proved excellent. What I find is that with the multi-star guiding, I need quite short exposure times, never more than a second, and very often half a second. And with that, I'll get in guiding certainly less than 1, and typically between 0.6 and 0.8. So that has proved quite successful. And really, I'm getting away with guiding that is rather better than I should expect. In this particular instance, I was only imaging Alberio, so it's just a double star, and I think particularly exciting to see on screen. But it does guide particularly effectively, given that I haven't actually achieved the 4:1 ratio that's generally regarded as the minimum ratio between the OTA and the guide scope. So this is the guiding as I would typically find it. As you can see here on this particular night, it's guiding at about 0.6, and if you look further down you'll see that it's actually set at half a second. Now admittedly I set, as you can see here, I set to minimize the amount of movement within the graph. I will often run trend lines just to see how the general trend is running, and in this instance I was recording a peck curve. I've subsequently lost the peck curve, which is typical of me, but I have to say my conclusion was that actually it does help to stabilize to a degree the quality of the guiding. It seems to take away some of the little indiscretions you get as the worm rotates. It obviously is measured and taken account for any variables that there are. So then we come to autofocus and plate solving. Now I have to say autofocus is slightly timely and not that bad, but it takes a little bit of patience to let it run its course. So I've clipped this particular section just to keep it to a minimum. And I stuck the Bartonov mask in the middle because sometimes, particularly if I'm not operating in APT, I'll use a Bartonov mask. But even in APT, there are offerings within the software that allow you to use a Bartonov. And it could be argued that it's actually a quicker way of working, but I find, given I get it right, that the auto-focusing actually works very well, which hopefully you'll see here.
Exposure started.
So it takes a number of exposures, and each time it's moving the focus slightly. What you do have to do to get this working effectively, you have to measure and build in the backlash that you've got within the focusing system. But having done that,
exposure finished,
it's generally quite reliable, and it will draw a curve where it goes in and out of focus, and eventually derive the point at which there is correct focus, as you can see here. And I've clipped this down, so it actually takes longer than this.
Auto-focusing finished.
So that's the process finished. And I find it's extremely accurate. Similarly, plate solving, which is the most wonderful thing in the world. Almost anyone who's got into plate solving would tell you that it's like a road to Damascus experience. And sort of sit there in wonderment, thinking to yourself, why didn't I do this before? Because the accuracy with which it positions an object into the field of view is amazing, and the control it gives you over the selection of an image is amazing. This works, I find, very reliable, having correctly downloaded the databases that you need for the various star catalogues.
Exposure started. Exposure finished. Image solved.
It then will sync you again. Having got an object to center, it syncs the drawing. And then you go to ++, which refines the position and brings it pretty much dead center. And you can see the system, knowing what you're looking at, the system will give you an indicator of how big the object will be within the field of view. So that's that, and it is a system that works for me, that's for sure. I find Astrophotography Tool to be a very good system, particularly as it doesn't require me to change to a zoom camera, which moving to ASI Air would do.
Exposure start.
So then if you look at processing software, I use a range of programs. I always refer to it as a process, that there isn't a single piece of software. Some come close, but there isn't a single piece of software that I find does everything I want to do with an image. So I generally tend to use Deep Sky Stacker for stacking. I find it very acceptable. What I will do is I will do a registration of the subs first, and then I will stack above a threshold. So I do a little bit of selection in terms of the quality of the subs. You can also stack in Affinity Photo, but it's not, I don't think, quite as controlled as Deep Sky Stacker. And I will use both Affinity Photo and Photoshop to adjust the final image. Of course, when it comes to planetary images, then I will tend to use Auto Stack It and Registax for those sort of images. So just quickly looking at how I process things using Affinity Photo. Now I have to say this might horrify some people, but it's the way I do it, and it delivers the sort of results which I'm currently capable of. So the first thing you do is look at the background, which to my eye is a bit grey, and I've got a nice dust bunny. So it gives you this little disc which you can move to a selected area in the background. And then when you say click here and say sample that position, you can see it makes a decision. Now that's not fixed. You can adjust this slider to alter the density of the background as suits. But I'm more happy with dark skies than some people. But anyway, the next thing you can do is to go into sharpening. Now, it has some good sharpening tools. In this case, I'm going overboard, so I've gone 100%. But you can see how it punches the stars through, sharpens the whole image up. You can then go to vibrance, which you can select various degrees, but what it does is it allows you to control saturation and vibrance. Very straightforward, really. And you merge, and that retains that information. You have lots of other things that you can do. For instance, levels, and you can access levels very easily. There's a shortcut on the keyboard. In this case, I've just pulled the highlight end a little further. You can see its effect on the image. Once again, you say merge. And the good thing about most of the processes within this is there is absolutely no reason why you can't revisit. So I can go back in if I want and give it another stab on the sharpening if I feel there's a little bit more to be had. Other things you can do are selective color. Selective color allows you to go into specific areas of color within the image. So if I look particularly at this cyan in the center of the nebula, I can select cyan and I can pull the cyan up. And similarly, I can take down the contribution from other colors within that area. So I can pull back the magenta and the yellow to enhance further the content of cyan. And once again, you can go merge. I'm just pulling the magenta up a little bit. So then when you're happy with the image, and I can play for hours, and the biggest secret you ever learn is knowing when to stop. But I can then export it, because like most of these programs like GIMP, it doesn't allow you to save your final image. You have to export it and choose a particular format. In this case, I generally go for a PNG. You give it a name, I just put AFP in, and then you click save, and there you go. The image is saved. So this is where I am now, the general level of my images. There are many people out there who produce more exciting and better quality images, but you know, at the end of the day, you have something to aspire to. So I'll continue to work to improve. Not guaranteed that I will, but I always think that whatever you produce yourself is the thing that gives you the greatest pleasure. And that doesn't mean you can't admire and enjoy other people's images. And you can see it's a diverse. The moon still features large. I like the planets, and I'm looking forward to them coming through stronger this year. Solar imaging has become something that I'm increasingly interested in. And even on occasions, taking my DSLR, or these days the smartphone, out to capture things like the cloud formations we get in the summer. Just touching base on equipment, there are a few other items that play a part. I have internal equipment, particularly computers, that I still use. One of the reasons that I save my images onto a freestanding hard drive, a solid state drive, is it gives me the ability to transfer the images across to my desktop, which is still something I like to do because it's a very comfortable place to work. And of course, these days I can use TeamViewer and actually control the telescope from indoors if it's a particularly cold night. Other little things, I've got a refractor that's set up specifically for solar imaging. I have my new lightweight mount currently with my 150 Maksutov, but my aspirations, as we'll come to, will be in due course to replace that with an apochromatic refractor. Other couple of things I have, mainly related to planetary, is I've got quite a nice flip mirror with a focuser that allows me to parafocal the camera image with the visual image, and particularly tiny objects that you're trying to center. If you're doing it effectively with a hand controller, that still proves useful. And I also have, as yet untested, an atmospheric dispersion corrector, which I intend to apply to the planets in the forthcoming year. So where to next? Well, hopefully not for a while, the headstone on the right, although the lottery win can come as soon as it possibly likes, because that'll make life a little bit easier. First priority really for me is from left to right is a new saddle for the mount, because I think the standard one on the HEQ5 is poor, and this will give a bit more support and rather more stability to the scope. Then, as I've said, I'd like to move my Maksutov on and replace it with an apochromatic refractor. And then maybe at some time in the future, almost certainly still a color camera, but a cooled color camera, almost certainly from Zoo, in order that I can then investigate the use of an ASI Air. But these are all things that will come in due course, dependent on how much time I've got left and how much money she allows me to spend. But this is probably the best lesson. Before you start charging off to buy more gear, perhaps the best thing you can do is learn a bit more about using the existing equipment. Hopefully that's been of interest. It's a bit self-centered, I know, but thank you much for listening.